What are these? These might look like some ordinary Corinthian columns found on a Greek or Roman temple, but in fact they are not. This picture is intended as bait. Instead, this picture is actually not of a Greek or Roman temple, but a mosque in Tunisia, the Great Mosque of Kairouan. And this is the topic for a multimedia power presentation, the classics and medieval Islam. Medieval Islam had its golden age between approximately the 8th and the 13th century, during the period under the rule of the Abbasid Caliphate, and this is the period we will focus on. During this time, stable political structures, a strong economic system, and religious and cultural tolerance allowed the Islamic world to flourish, especially in cities where classical culture and knowledge was gathered and translated. Leaps forward in cultural and scientific development were made. The government valued classical culture and knowledge and invested heavily into translators and scholars, as well as artists who worked on them. Our aim then is to describe the role of the Abbasids in the revival of Greek and Roman culture. It will be important to describe several aspects of this cultures of the Islamic states that they incorporated into their own, and which parts they chose not to. Finally, we hope to be able to demonstrate the synthesis that was created by the transfer of classical culture and art from the West to the East, and then back to the West just before the Renaissance. In addition to preserving information, medieval Islam contributed heavily as scholars, architects, and artists made significant new insights and would later pass on this information back to Europeans. To organize our presentation and address the process that I just described, we will be addressing two major parts. The first being architecture, and the second being philosophy and science.
The classical tradition lives on in Islamic architecture. When the Caliphate armies conquered North Africa and southern Spain, they took over territories which had been part of the classical world for centuries. The Muslims were inspired by the ancient cultures that they came across, and in time they integrated ancient architectural features into their own architecture. The Great Mosque of Kairouan in Tunisia, which we started this presentation with, is a great example of the early stage of the integration of ancient architecture into Islamic architecture, and the synthesis that would later come about. The mosque is one of the oldest mosques in the world and was a benchmark for all later mosques built in North Africa and southern Spain. It was an important center of Islamic and secular scholarship in its heydays. The ancient architectural influences are clearly on display. The Corinthian columns, which we started this presentation with, are used throughout the building's interior and exterior. Many of them were originally taken from ancient sites in Tunisia, like, for example, Carthage. There are other classical elements on display, however, for example, the domes, tympanums, frescoes and mosaics, and other classical columns like Ionic and Dorian-style columns. The mosque's interior is built in the style we call hypostyle, meaning a hallway supported by a long row of columns. This style was inspired by the Greek naos and Roman cella styles of their temples. Moving on, we will look at the two most famous Islamic constructions in southern Spain. First we will look at the Mosque Cathedral of Cordoba, also known as the Mezquita. This structure, which is nowadays a cathedral, was originally built by the Muslim rulers of Spain in 784 CE, intended as a mosque, and it is regarded as one of the finest examples of Moorish architecture in the world. Here too in this building, the ancient architectural influences are clearly visible. There are Roman columns and capitals made from the remains of Roman buildings in the area. Furthermore, there are mosaics, a magnificent dome, and the interior also has a hypostyle design, like the Great Mosque of Kairouan has. An innovation on the classical style, and an advancement we can see in the synthesis that's being created, is the use of double arches, which has made it possible to construct higher ceilings in the mosque's interior. The second, and probably the most famous Islamic construction in southern Spain, is the Alhambra in Granada. The Alhambra was originally constructed as a fortress and later upgraded to a palace of the emirs of Granada. The building is of a later date than the previous buildings discussed, with the current structure dating from around the mid-13th century, but it is a nice example of the evolution of later Islamic architecture, with the synthesis more or less complete, and therefore we can't skip this. The classical elements are less clearly visible. The Islamic style has evolved and come more clearly into their own, but the classical origins of the Islamic style are still recognizable in the use of arches, columns, mosaics, and other classical elements.
At the time of the birth of Islam, classical scholarship and learning was already in decline. The Islamic Abbasid dynasty was vitally important to preserve what still existed of this classical learning. These rulers were multicultural when it came to science and philosophy, and wanted scientific works translated into Arabic. The result was that all Greek scientific and philosophical works were translated. In 762, Baghdad was established as the new capital of this dynasty, and translators and scholars flocked to the city. The House of Wisdom, of which you see a depiction here, was an institution of learning, founded by the Abbasid ruler Al-Mamun. Baghdad was a place where translations were made of all kinds of works, including magic, all fields of mathematics, medicine, music, mineralogy, logic, and metaphysics, to name just a few. This contributed immensely to the takeoff of science in the Arabic world. These scholars were particularly fascinated with Aristotle, whose work Physics was translated multiple times. The translations and commentaries on classical source material and the science that inspired it had a decided influence on scientific thinking, not only in the Muslim world but also in Europe. Tim McIntosh Smith published a book on Arabic culture last year and has said that you could actually consider the Abbasids, quote, princes of the Renaissance, and consider the European episode a continuation after a long hiatus. Baghdad became the pinnacle of Islamic civilization, and after the Abbasids disappeared, multiple capitals all over the Islamic world wanted to emulate Baghdad, and therefore also sponsored scientists and philosophers. One of those capitals was Cordoba in Spain. All this interest in Greek philosophy continued for a long time. The philosopher Ibn Rushd, in Europe known as Averroes, was one of the most well-known and appreciated Muslim philosophers in the Christian world. In the 12th century he wrote commentaries on Aristotle's work, and these were so much appreciated among European Christians that they gave him a title, the commentator. He was considered an expert when it came to Aristotle. He wanted, like Aristotle, to understand the world by rational analysis, and thereby had a lot of influence on medieval scholastic philosophy in Europe. The scholastic philosopher Thomas Aquinas, whom you can see depicted in a glorious position here, was not a fan of his and called him the distorter. In this painting you can see Averroes lying at his feet, the message being of course that Aquinas had surpassed him.
Thank you for listening to our presentation on medieval Islam. We hope that we have helped you discover a newfound appreciation for the role of medieval Islam and its influence on classics and classical culture. Thank you.